Okay, this lecture is replacing the lecture that I would have given on Tuesday, April 14th, and I'm sorry again that I wasn't able to be in class today, but I'm going to be finishing up talking about plant evolution. And so before I start, the learning objectives are basically the exact same that they were on Thursday. So for the 7 plant traits that you have in your table that you've been filling out for this class, I want you to know the structure, be able to describe the structure of those traits, what their function is in a plant, and then be able to talk about why those were important innovations or important in the evolutionary history of plants, why they would have been favored by natural selection. And before we jump into new traits, I want to show you this video that did not work in class on Thursday. It's just a couple of minutes long. Here we go.
During the Devonian, there was no life on the uplands or on much of the arid plain, but along the banks of the rivers, the earliest plants had learnt how to master life out of water. This is an old quarry on the Epind Mountain north of Brecon. One of the oldest fossilised land plants in the world has been found here. Diane Edwards has also analysed these. It's this little thing here,
yes.
Is it?
And it's called Cooksonia. It's just a few centimetres tall. It's got stems which have no leaves, they branch simply, and then we have the sporangia at the tips.
This is vitally important because it led on to the trees and everything else we see around us.
Yes. Now, the invasion of the land by plants was quite a difficult business. They had to leave behind water, and so they had to cope with living without water. And so in this particular plant, we see for the first time the inventions of the land, the waterproof covering, which prevented it drying out, and little tubes inside, which allowed them to conduct water from the soil up towards the sporangia. And the most amazing thing of all is that the cells that we see in this, the earliest of the vascular plants, are exactly the same cells that we see in the foxgloves around us today, and even in that tree there.
Cooksonia grew on the river shores of Wales over 400 million years ago. This is a model of what it might have looked like. It probably had a moss-like structure with a spore-producing organ at its tip. It was the ancestor of all spore-producing plants. Comedwal in Snowdonia is an important location for one modern group of spore-producing plants that were around then and are still with us today. This is the alpine club moss, a very simple plant, but quite common and widespread in the hills of Wales. These were the only plants around for millennia, but gradually new plants evolved and grew bigger and bigger. 410 million years ago, the earliest forms of vegetation would have barely brushed my toes. By 390 million years ago, they were at shin level, and by 380 million years ago, they were about a metre tall.
Okay, so again, I mentioned this in class, but I like that that video gives you some idea. Well, first of all, you get to see what some of the earliest plant ancestors looked like, or models of what they would have looked like, but also you get kind of a time frame for how long these evolutionary changes were taking place over. So, so this plant would have had cuticle, stoma, or stomata, and then also vascular tissue, some kind of primitive form of vascular tissue. So the plant that we ended class just getting to was pollen. So pollen evolved, I don't know the exact date, to be honest, sometime before 300 million years ago. So between 350 and 300 million years ago. And so this is a microscopic view of pollen. So if you were to describe the structure of pollen, it is the male gametophyte, and it's surrounded by a tough, airtight coat of a substance called sporopollenin. And so this is just a really, really tough outer coat around the pollen grain. So the function of pollen is that it having this watertight and airtight coat prevents desiccation of the male gametes. Okay, so that's the main function of pollen. It prevents the male gametes, which are inside of that pollen grain, from drying out. And in addition, it's also very lightweight, which means that it can be carried in the air. And so if we think about the evolutionary importance of pollen, what this meant was that plants no longer had to rely on water to carry sperm to an egg. Okay, and so if you think about pollen that we see now, we are just getting over the time of year when pollen is everywhere in the air. So hopefully it's really intuitive to you guys that pollen can be at least wind dispersed. Okay, so the earliest pollen-producing plants would have been relying on wind to disperse their gametes, the male gametes anyway, rather than water. Okay, so this is a much more efficient mode of dispersal for gametes. And so what I'll be asking you to do on the final exam is I actually want you to know where on the phylogeny different traits evolved. So in order to figure that out, so if I were to ask you where pollen evolved, for example, you would need to look at this phylogeny and decide, okay, which plant groups do I know have pollen? Okay, so I know that the mutation that created pollen, or the set of mutations anyway, must have occurred on the branch before I see all of those groups split. Okay, so in the case of pollen, we know that gymnosperms have pollen. So if you think about pine trees, a lot of the pollen that you see covering your car in the spring is from things like pine trees. So gymnosperms have pollen that is wind dispersed, and the angiosperms also produce pollen, but no other plants on this phylogeny do. So we know that pollen must have evolved before those two split apart. Okay, so pollen evolved somewhere on this branch down here. And there's another really important innovation that evolved at the same time, so sometime in the ancestor that led to both gymnosperms and angiosperms, and that is seeds. Okay, so pollen and seeds evolved pretty close in time with one another on this branch that led to gymnosperms and angiosperms. And the seeds are the third of the major innovations in plant evolution. So I want to jump ahead and start talking about, what the structure and function of seeds were in plants. So just the basic structure of a seed. This is a cross-section of a seed that's actually been stained, so the plant or the seed is not actually blue, but this is a stain to show you the different parts of the plant. The different parts of the seed. So what you can see in the middle here is the embryo. Okay, so the seed is what forms after sperm has successfully fertilized an egg, so in an ovule. So the embryo is that zygote, or the zygote forms into an embryo. So this is a really small individual, so this is a diploid. The seed also has nutritive tissue, and then the outside of the seed has this tough protective coat. Okay, so that's the structure. So the function of a seed is that this nutritive tissue provides nutrition for the embryo when it's first starting to grow, and the protective coat protects the embryo from potential seed predators, perhaps, but also from drying out. Okay, so this is a watertight coat. And so if we look at so that's the basic function of the seed. If we look at why this would have been important in plant evolutionary history, it allowed the plant or the embryo to disperse from the parent. Okay, so and here if we're looking at this seed, if we look at what actually happens with the seed, we can see that as soon as it germinates, the root starts growing into the ground. Then you see that early embryo, the cotyledon, emerge from the seed and then begin to grow. Okay, and this is obviously rooted in the ground in a real life situation. So having that nutrition packed into that seed meant that plants could have that early growth fueled by the nutrition in the seed rather than relying on nutrients from the environment. Okay, And so the other thing that I mentioned was that it allowed the embryo to disperse from the parent. And so if we look back at ferns, which have already split, so ferns do not have seeds. Seeds evolved after ferns split from the gymnosperms and angiosperms. If we look at what's happening in the ferns, remember, if you look at the bottom of this diagram here, remember that ferns and other more primitive plant groups are relying on water to carry sperm to the egg. When that happens, fertilization occurs, and then this diploid zygote grows up very close to the gametophyte. So here we have this gametophyte, which is one of the generations that we have alternating here in the plant life cycle. So the sporophyte and gametophyte are attached to one another, essentially. And so really primitive plants that before we had seeds, the gametophyte was actually providing nutrition for the growing sporophyte, or the next generation. Okay, so there was a very close association between these two generations. And so what having a seed allowed plants to do was to allow that embryo to get away from the parent, to not have to rely on the parent for nutrition. And so this meant that seeds and the offspring could actually colonize new habitats and not be dependent on the parent. And so once they got to that new habitat, they would have had that nutrition packed into the seed, which would have prevented them from having to compete with other plants that were potentially in the area. So they had kind of a head start with that nutrition packed into the seed with them. And then also because they had that the watertight, or the protective barrier on the outside, the seed coat, this means that seeds could lay dormant for a long time. Okay, they were not reliant on having water immediately in the area to germinate and grow. So seed plants have the ability, so seeds can actually hang out for long periods of time before they germinate and wait for good conditions. Okay, so just to go back to our phylogeny here, so we have the cuticle, which gave plants the ability to live in dry conditions. Vascular tissue gave structural support and water transport so that plants could grow taller, and then seeds allowed the embryos to disperse from the parents. Okay, so these were three very, very important things. So after this occurred, after seeds evolved, the gymnosperms really took off in terms of diversification. Okay, so once the plants had the ability to disperse to new locations and to not necessarily be reliant on water being right there, so they would have to germinate immediately, whole habitats that had been pretty inhospitable before, so like dry mountainsides, ephemeral habitats that are not always wet but seasonally wet, all of these places suddenly became hospitable to seed plants. Okay, so the gymnosperms began diversifying. So the gymnosperms and angiosperms, sorry, I'm going to go back. This split here occurred somewhere around 300 million years ago, and the gymnosperms started diversifying first. So they were the first to kind of take off in terms of starting to dominate the landscape. So gymnosperm literally means naked seed. So and some examples of gymnosperms that we still have around today are things like the conifers, so pines, spruces, and firs. And if you think about their seeds, so it's not that they necessarily produce seeds that have absolutely no protection, but if you think about a pine cone, for example, pine seeds, pine nuts, are inside this pine cone. So they're somewhat protected, but they're not fully enclosed in any kind of structure. Okay, and then the other thing is, so remember, gymnosperms have both seeds and pollen, so they produce pollen, but the pollen is dispersed by wind in all cases. Okay, so the earliest plants that produced pollen were taking advantage of wind to get their gametes spread around. So these are just some examples of gymnosperms, and I want to show this to you because most of the rest of the lecture I'm going to focus on angiosperms, so I just want to let you know that this is the sister group to angiosperms, or the flowering plants. Okay, so far, when we've talked about the environmental factors that were influencing the evolution of plants early on in their evolutionary history, it was mostly aspects of the physical environment of land that was responsible for favoring certain traits over others. So a lot of the early key innovations were all about being able to survive and reproduce in dry habitats. Okay, so it's all about getting adaptations that allow you to live without water. And so what I want to spend the last part of this lecture talking about are some of the biotic factors that influenced, or in other words, how living organisms influence plants later in their evolutionary history. And so species interactions are at least thought to be, hypothesized to be, strongly influential within the evolution of angiosperms. Okay, so the two traits that we haven't talked about yet are flowers and fruits, and these are traits that define the angiosperms. So I'll give you a minute. Well, you can obviously pause the video if you want to think about this. So a question that I might ask you is, what kinds of organisms or what kinds of species interactions influence the evolution of both of these important traits in the angiosperms? So if you want to think about it, you can pause. So in the case of flowers, it would have been animal pollinators. So animals that were able to fly, that were able to carry pollen from plant to plant, would have been strongly influential on the evolution of flowers. And then if we think about fruits, fruit evolution was driven a lot by animal seed dispersers. Okay, so animals that eat fruit and then take the seed to a better location. So in both of these cases, animals, so whether it's flying animals or animals that are pretty mobile in some way, had a lot of impact on the evolution of plants. And so I want to now go in, like we've been doing with the rest of the traits, and talk about the structure and function of both of these traits. So I want to start with flowers. And flowers, for those of you who had this trait for your homework and you were responsible for looking up information about it, it might have been overwhelming to think about how much information to include in your description of the flower structure. Okay, because flowers are pretty complex structures in the plant. But what I've done here is I've put in bold the parts of the flower that I want you to know. So in general, the flower is made up of a stamen, or the male reproductive part of the flower, the carpel, which is the female reproductive part, and the carpel contains the ovary. Okay, so the ovary is this part here that surrounds the ovules, and then flowers also have petals. Okay, and so if we think about the function of that the flower serves in a plant, if you're thinking broadly about the flower as a structure, then I think an appropriate answer here would be that flowers serve the function of reproduction. Okay, so they are a reproductive structure. But if you want to get more specific about it, you can actually think about each of these main parts here, and you can think about, okay, if we think about the flower, what are the structural parts of a flower, and what's the function of each structural part of the flower? So for the stamen, so remember this is the male reproductive part, the main function of the stamen is that it produces pollen. It produces and displays pollen, which remember has the male gametes inside. The carpel contains the ovary, and the ovary was also this was a trait that evolved within the angiosperms only. So the ovary actually protects the female gametophyte. So it protects the female reproductive parts, and it also contains the ovules, which are, the plant is hoping to get fertilized by these sperm that are being carried over by the pollen. And then finally, if we look at the petal down here, so petals are primarily, the function of the petal is just to attract pollinators. Okay, so things like bees, butterflies, birds, whatever animal it is that might be carrying pollen from plant to plant, the petal is all about attracting those animals' attention. Okay, and then another thing that I don't have listed on here, but nectar is often present in flowers, and again, this is all for animal pollinators. So we have a nectar as a sugary reward for the insects or birds or other animals that fly that are pollinating plants. Okay, so then if we think about the evolutionary importance of the flower, this allowed for more efficient pollination. Okay, so yeah, if you have an animal carrying your pollen from flower to flower, and especially if that animal happens to be pretty specialized and is going from, a flower of your same species to another flower of the same species, then this is a much more efficient way to deposit pollen than relying on the air or the wind to carry pollen to another member of the same species. Okay, so much more efficient way of dispersing male gametes. All right, so here is just another example of a simplified diagram of a flower. And so the next trait that I want to talk about is the fruit. Okay, so if you think about the fruit is very closely tied to the flower. So if we look at this flower here, this is a tomato flower actually, and you'll notice, so here we have the ovary, so this is the female part of the flower, and inside we have these ovules. So if this tomato flower is successfully pollinated, so if pollen is deposited here and the sperm make it down and fertilize these ovules, then seeds will develop from those. So remember, seeds are just zygotes or embryos, so new individuals that can take root. And then the fruit is actually derived from the ovary. Okay, so if you've ever seen a tomato flower in real life, they're quite tiny. So we have these very, very tiny flowers with these fairly small ovaries that in some cases can grow to be these really, really giant fruits. Okay, and so the main structural parts of the fruit that I want you to know, first I want you to know that it's derived from the ovary, so it's an enlarged ovary essentially, and it contains seeds. And often the flesh that makes up a fruit is nutritious and or brightly colored. So that's the structure. So if we think about the function of a fruit, the function of a fruit is primarily to protect seeds from damage. So in some cases, the fruit has some kind of hard structure around it. So if you think about something like an avocado, so tomato is often obviously pretty soft and fleshy, but something like an avocado has this extra layer of protection around the seeds. So it in part protects the seeds, and then it also aids in dispersal. Okay, and it can do that in a couple of different ways. So, yeah, the main function of seeds is to disperse the main function of fruits is to disperse seeds. And so one way that this can happen is just by, so this is a maple seed up here at the top. So maple seeds have these appendages that act as kind of wings or almost like helicopter blades. If you've ever seen maple seeds dropping from trees, you can kind of watch them whirl down. And so having this appendage, which is a version of a fruit, actually helps this seed end up further away from its parent, which reduces competition between parents and offspring. So this is not a fruit that relies on animal dispersal, but it's helping the seed disperse nonetheless. So fruits are always about dispersal. You can also think of dandelion flowers when they go to seed. I don't know how many of you did this as kids, but I did this as a kid. My daughter's doing this right now with all the dandelions in our yard. You can blow the dandelion seeds and they have the kind of feathery appendages that help them, fly through the air and end up in a new spot to hopefully land and germinate. Okay, so fruits are all about dispersal. And then many of the fruits that we think of as actual fruits are fleshy and nutritious or brightly colored because they are attracting some kind of animal. And so the idea here is that fruits in general increase the likelihood that seeds end up in a good habitat to germinate and grow. So I mentioned with the fruits that help seeds disperse by wind, they're helping the seed get away from the parent, so that reduces competition. And then the ones that are relying on animal dispersal, they are, even when they're eaten, the seeds often have mechanisms that protect them from the digestive system of whatever animal is eating it. So when they get pooped out the other end, the poop that they're landing in often has nutrients that are good for the seed, and if the animal has moved very far between the time that it ate the seed and pooped, then the seed has gotten moved to a new place that's hopefully more favorable for growing. And a good example of this, of bird dispersal in particular, is mistletoe. So in the winter, you may notice that some trees are completely bare, so they've dropped all their leaves, as all deciduous trees do. But you'll often see these patches, these clumps of greenery still in the trees during winter. And so this is mistletoe, which is a parasitic plant. And when mistletoe flowers, or after it flowers, at least if pollination is successful, then it produces these fruits, so little white berries. Birds eat these berries, and then the actual flesh of the berry is really, really sticky. So when the bird, gets ready to poop out the seed, it actually sticks to the bird's butt, and the bird kind of has to wipe it on whatever branch or whatever they happen to be sitting on, which hopefully for the mistletoe is the branch of a tree. So the bird wipes off this sticky seed, and then that acts as kind of glue that holds the seed to the branch, so then the seed can germinate and start parasitizing this tree. So that's how we ended up with all of these clumps of mistletoe up in this tree. So it wasn't wind dispersal, it was bird dispersal, which was pretty directed. Okay, so if we go back to our phylogeny here, both the flower and fruit are present in all angiosperms. So both of those traits evolved somewhere before we see all the radiation or the diversification of angiosperms. Okay, so they'd be down here only on the branch leading to angiosperms. So they are both absent in the gymnosperms. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about angiosperm diversification. So if you noticed in this phylogeny down here, the angiosperms are represented by this single branch. Okay, so this kind of gives you the impression that there aren't that many species within the angiosperms, which is very, very far from the truth. So if we look at this phylogeny here, this is a phylogeny that was put together specifically to look at the diversity within angiosperms. And if you count the angiosperm species, at least that we know about today that are living, there are over 250,000 angiosperm species. And if we compare that to the gymnosperms, which are their closest relatives, there are only about 1,100 species of living gymnosperms. Okay, so there are many, many more angiosperm species today than there are gymnosperms. And that is in part due to the fact, so I think I mentioned earlier that angiosperms and gymnosperms split. So this split that occurred back here occurred around 300 million years ago, but the radiation or diversification of angiosperms didn't occur until about 140 million years ago. So the gymnosperms actually diversified earlier than the angiosperms did. And so if you look, this is a graph here showing millions of years ago here on the x-axis, and then the number of species that have been found in the fossil record. So these are not huge numbers here because these are just fossilized species, but the number of species in different plant groups over time. Okay, and the height of this line is showing you how many conifers there were, And then the space between here and here is showing you how many pteridophytes there were, and then this is showing you how many cycads, etc. So all of these are gymnosperms. So you can see that this starts about 145 million years ago. So the gymnosperms were common even earlier than that. So when dinosaurs were really dominating the landscape, one of your mastering biology questions referred to this. Gymnosperms would have been the primary plants in the landscape when dinosaurs were around, at least in the early days of the dinosaurs. So this period, so between 145 million years ago and 65 million years ago, which is when we have the mass extinction that killed off the dinosaurs, during this period we start off with mostly gymnosperms, and then here, about 140 million years ago, you have the origin of the angiosperms, and you can see that somewhere around 80 million years ago, we start to see a big increase in the number of angiosperms and a decrease in the number of gymnosperms. Okay, so it's not that there has never been a lot of gymnosperms. It's that a lot of gymnosperm species have actually gone extinct and are not around today, whereas the angiosperms have done quite well. So people have been really interested in why it is that there are so many angiosperm species, because it really indicates that they've been really, really successful. So if you have a lot of species, if today angiosperm plants dominate the landscape, people have hypothesized different reasons for why they've done so well. And one thing that I'm not going to talk a lot about is that angiosperm species are much more productive, so they're more efficient at photosynthesis than gymnosperms are, so they can use carbon dioxide more efficiently. But then another popular hypothesis is that animals, remember pollinators and seed dispersers are thought to have driven the evolution of angiosperms, that both of these groups of animals may have helped create all of the species that we see today, or may have played a role in promoting speciation within the flowering plants. And so the idea here, and this is something we've already talked about a little bit with regards to pollinators, is that if we look around today, a lot of plants are very specialized for a particular kind of animal pollinator. Okay, so we have the carrion flowers that are pollinated by flies, which are animals that like the smell of rotting flesh. So these flowers smell like rotting flesh and look pink like rotting flesh. We have red tube-like flowers that are pollinated by hummingbirds, and then very different kinds of flowers that are pollinated by bees. And you can see different things for butterflies even. So the idea here is that each of these different groups of animals have selected very specific traits in flowers, which has driven differences between groups. So we talked about speciation before spring break. So what could be going on here is that if you had a single plant population that got split somehow, and one of the populations was being pollinated by bumblebees and the other was being pollinated by hummingbirds, over time those two different kinds of pollinators could be favoring very different traits. So selecting for very different traits in those separated populations. And so over time, if there's no gene flow, we might expect those two populations to diverge and form new species. Okay, so that's the idea with pollination. And then there's a similar hypothesis with seed dispersal. So we see similar seed dispersal syndromes in plants as well. So if you look, so fleshy fruits are usually dispersed by mammals, and so these are also things that we tend to eat. So things like apples, why is that the only thing coming to mind? Oranges, things like that. And it's actually really interesting to think about things like avocados or cantaloupes. And I know a lot of these fruits have been selected by humans to be larger than they were in the wild. But something like an avocado I don't think is that much bigger than the wild species, which means that at some point there was an animal big enough to eat an avocado whole, digest it, and then, that huge avocado seed made it through their digestive tract and out on the other end. So it's kind of interesting to think about some of the fruits and seeds that you see in nature and think about, wow, what are the animals that used to be able to disperse these? Because there must have been animals that were able to do that. Okay, we have fleshy fruits dispersed by mammals. Red fruits, especially berries, tend to be dispersed by birds. So those are the traits that birds are favoring. And then a type of fruit that probably a lot of you don't know about is an eliasome. So there are some seeds that have, and this doesn't look like much of a fruit at all, I'm sure to you guys, but they have these little appendages attached to the seed, and this appendage is really high in fats. Okay, and so if you see a seed like this, so a lot of Trillium species have seeds like this, they are probably dispersed by ants. Okay, so what these ants will do is once the seeds fall on the ground, they will pick them up by these appendages, take them back to their ant nest, and then they're not really interested in the seed, but they're interested in this fatty deposit here. So they'll chew off the fatty deposit, which is not important for the seed, and then they will discard the seed somewhere in their trash pile within their nest or somewhere right outside the nest. And so if you think about what ants are eating and the kind of trash that they're discarding, it's often, so it's going to be organic material that might be high in nutrients. So having ants take the seeds back to their nest and then throw them in a trash pile is actually a pretty good place for a seed to germinate. Okay, so in all of these cases, the fruits are helping these seeds get to new places, and there's different kinds of animals that are specialized for different kinds of fruits. Okay, so I'm going to end just by going back to the phylogenetic tree here, and I just really want to stress that I actually do want you to know where each of these traits evolved. Okay, so on the second exam, quite a few people did not do well on the question where I told you about a trait that was in a certain group of organisms and had you map it on the tree. So on the final exam, I'm actually not even going to give you that much information. I'm going to literally give you a phylogenetic tree, and I'm going to say where on this tree did vascular tissue evolve, and you'll have to mark it. Okay, so what I'm doing, the reason I spent so much time on this kind of small number of traits is that I'm not giving you a whole lot of traits because I really want you to know a lot about the ones I'm giving you, because I think they're just really, really important in the evolutionary history of life. Okay, so the homework that you need to do before Thursday, please make sure you've read chapter 32. You don't need to read the last section, which goes through all the different groups of fungi, but the first 3 sections. The SAIS evaluation for our lecture is still up. I think it's up through the 27th of April. So, fill that out if you are willing. I'd love to get the feedback. And you can upload your screenshot on Blackboard. I created an assignment for that. And the other thing is, please start studying for the final exam. Even if it's just, going through and answering the review questions from the lectures we've already had. The material that we're covering now is not as conceptually difficult as the material we've covered on past exams, but there's a lot of it. So if you wait until even a week before the final to start studying, I know you have lots of other finals as well, it's going to be hard to know it all before the exam. So please just make sure that you're keeping up. Yeah, and I think that's it. So I will see you all on Thursday.